So, good morning and welcome. A special welcome to our clients, CIBC First Caribbean colleagues, and specially invited guests. I am Tiffany Grosvenor Drakes, Senior Manager, Strategy and Economics here at CIBC First Caribbean, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today titled The Next Big Wave. Recent developments across the global economic landscape, including the ongoing war in Ukraine, surging international commodity prices, and the sharp monetary tightening to fight inflation, have interrupted the global economy's rebound from the COVID 19 pandemic and have no doubt threatened the economic performance of the Caribbean. More recently, turbulence in financial markets due to a few US bank failures sparked fears of contagion and issues with financial stability risk. Under the weight of these developments, growth of the world economy and the economies of the region's major trading partners slowed considerably in 2022. However, economic recovery in the Caribbean strengthened, largely underpinned by a robust tourism recovery and pent up tourism demand. Still, with the global economy projected to slow even further in 2023, many economies in the Caribbean yet to reach pre pandemic levels of output, and with inflation rates still high and other downside risks looming, what are the implications for the Caribbean's economic performance? What impact do rising international interest rates have on markets in the Caribbean, given that many continue to struggle with high debt levels? And how have trends in labor markets, demographics, and credit conditions evolved since the pandemic? These issues and more will be covered in what I expect to be a very exciting and engaging discussion with our two distinguished panelists. I now want to introduce our host for today's webinar, Miss Sabrina Supersad. Sabrina?
Thank you, Tiffany. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Sabrina Supersad, Director of Foreign Exchange and Derivative Sales at CIBC First Caribbean. I'm happy to see today that we have participants that span both Northern and Southern Caribbean. According to the old adage, alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much more. On that note, we would like to know where you are listening in from today. So please complete our poll that you see on your screen. As Tiffany indicated, globally, we continue to experience shocks in the markets ranging from persistent supply shortages, rising inflation, higher cost of borrowing, and most recently, the failure of a couple of US regional banks. Could these factors put together create the next big wave of economic shock to our regional economies? And if so, how do we as a region prepare ourselves? To help us navigate this, we have a panel of two esteemed Caribbean economists, Professor Roger Hossain and Dr. Justin Ram. Professor Hossain is a graduate of the University of West Indies who went on to obtain his PhD in economics from Cambridge University in 2000. He joined the Department of Economics UWE at the St. Augustine campus later that year and currently holds the position of Professor of Economics and Coordinator of the Trade and Economic Development Unit at the university. He has written and advised on 12 books and has published over 75 papers in both regional and international journals. He has worked extensively throughout the region for the World Bank, Caribbean Development Bank, IDB, BPTT Atlantic, and many more multinational companies and governments. His current work focuses on macroeconomic dynamics of small Caribbean states and the spillover growth effects from China on the CARICOM. Our second speaker, Dr. Justin Ram, is also no stranger to many of us. He is the CEO of Justin Ram Advisory Associates Services and managing partner of Resilient Partners. He was previously director of the economics department at the Caribbean Development Bank. He has over 25 years of practical advisory, research, and management experience. He has worked as economist in over 32 countries across the Caribbean, Central Asia, Africa, and Europe. He's currently Program Director and Lead Advisor to the Premier for the National Delivery Unit in the Turks and Caicos Islands government. Dr. Ram has a PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Before we start today's proceedings, I just want to highlight some housekeeping matters. For the convenience of all attendees, your microphone will remain muted during the presentations by our speakers. However, we very much want to hear from you today, so we will have a designated question and answer segment following the presentations and panel discussions. All you need to do is click the button labeled Q&A and then type your questions into the window. Of course, we will aim to get to as many as we can before the end of today's session. Also, just to note that the opinions expressed by our presenters during today's webinar are those of the individuals in their respective personal capacities and don't represent the views of First Caribbean International Bank. So without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Roger Hossain.
Good morning, and thank you all for the invitation to speak. Sabrina, so would my slides be loaded now?
Yes, they are.
So whilst I am waiting for the slides, to see the slides, I note your closing comments very carefully, and I will ensure that we navigate around it. Now, I'm not seeing the slides as yet, but what I would start off by saying is that the world GDP is slowing, and if you look at the World Economic Outlook, you would see that when you compare the decade of 2000 to 2009, and I'm seeing the slides now, thanks. When you compare the decade of 2000 to 2009 with 2010 to 2019, you see a slight decline in economic growth. And when you look at the period 2023 to 2028, I'm taking off the period of the pandemic itself. When you look at 2023 to 2028, you see an even lower growth rate. And this is what CARICOM has to deal with. This is what we have to deal with moving into the medium term, this slowdown in global economic activity. And this slowdown in global economic activity would have many ripples for the Caribbean area, because the Caribbean area we benefit from tourism, we benefit from spillover growth in the different regions of the world, we benefit from remittances, we benefit from foreign direct investment. So once the global economy is showing a trajectory like this, Caribbean economies would need to pay close attention and to look within that growth rate for 2023 to 2028 in the international community, and see where there are possible opportunities in which there's even stronger growth that CARICOM countries can benefit from. As the next slide would show, the Caribbean populations are not growing exceptionally fast in relation to any other area. It's about the same speed. So our dynamic will not come from a rapid increase in population size in that manner. The next slide would show that as we move forward, though, we are seeing something of relevance here in terms of the pace at which CARICOM economies are growing. Something has been going on with our growth performance. And if I use data from the 1980s, moving forward, you would see the 80s, then the 90s, and the period 2000 to 2009, and 2010 to 2019, you would see a slowdown in economic activity. And this is where entities like FCIB have a role to play. The economic growth performance of the region can benefit from the type of strategic investments groups like you all can make. And I'm sure I saw somewhere in a note from Sabrina where she mentioned US 500 million was invested in various areas. Now, this slowdown in growth, although we see from 2023 to 2028 a projected growth of 4.27, and I note that I don't like to emphasize projected growth too much, because as we saw with the pandemic and we saw with the Russian-Ukraine war, those things are still yet to be realized. What we have to do is to look at our existing production function that is yielding this decline in economic output and see how we could improve on it moving forward. And if you look at the column 2010 to 2019, you would see when we exclude Guyana for obvious reasons. Guyana is just exploding in economic growth. You could see that we are amongst the listed areas in terms of population size, areas less than 500,000 and so on, 5 million to 100 million, more than 100 million. You would see that the CARICOM sphere with populations less than 5 million, excluding Guyana, is the slowest growing bloc amongst the listed countries. And it's something that we definitely have to take in mind. Next slide. And as we look at the growth performance of these CARICOM economies in particular, it has not been really sterling. If you look at the period 1980 to 2019, you would see, yes, you had some countries like Belize that grow fairly quickly, and Antigua and Barbuda, and St. Kitts and Nevis, but then you had some struggling economies like Suriname and Jamaica, Haiti, and Barbados in that time period indicated there. When we look at the medium-term period, 2022 to 2028, we see that some countries are doing much better than others, or expected to do much better than others, like Guyana, to a large extent. And then you have countries, again, like Antigua and Barbuda, that is showing some buoyancy in growth. And when we look at the period 2010 to 2028, we see that some economies have basically entered a period of strong stagnation. If you look at the Trinidad and Tobago economy here, and this is IMF data, you would see the good performance there, and then Suriname being really lagging behind those other countries. When you look at the Guyanese data, you would see Guyana represents a tremendous opportunity for growth, and therefore for resources from around the region to benefit in one form or the other. Next slide. Now, it would be impractical given the sharp increase in income in China and the rapid growth of India for Caribbean countries to ignore the performance in these two economies. And I am of the view, as the global economy moves forward and the CARICOM economies in experiencing this slowdown in economic activity, pay more attention to opportunities that emerge in China and India. Now, China has been heavily present in the region in one form or the other in recent times. They are helping to build embassies. They are importing more and more goods from the CARICOM. They are exporting a lot of their goods to the CARICOM sphere, and they have been courting countries in different ways. India is only now taking off. They recently took over the record for having the largest population on the planet, and it's a country with a large population base, and therefore CARICOM exporters can benefit from that country once we can find goods that they are buying more of and that we have the capability to put. Team, this is where a lot of homework needs to be done now. In my view, the bank and other banks and other financial institutions need to dig deep into the data. They need to do analysis that would tell them, given the slowdown in global economic activity by the World Economic Outlook, what does this 1,000% growth in Guyana mean from 2022 to 2028? What does that? What are the areas that are expected to grow? What are CARICOM countries able to sell to Guyana that Guyana is buying more of that these CARICOM countries are producing? And therein lies the possibility of a formula that regional economic activity and regional integration, one appropriately strengthened by using the right type of structured approach, could help identify and target opportunities for CARICOM countries within Guyana. I recommend that we do the same thing with India and with China. Look at the commodities on the upswing of their demand, look at the commodities in which we are capable of producing more, and then look at the area of overlap so we can see where exactly are the commodities we have comparative advantage in that Guyana, Suriname, India, and China are buying more. And I mentioned Suriname because of the amount of oil they have been finding in recent times and the prospective boom that can take place there. And let us see how this can benefit the investors in the region and the way that the bank and the other development institution lend resources so that it benefits us in a direct way. You hand a ball to a bowler and not a footballer in order to be example. I'm talking about a cricket ball here. So in this way, when you put this information out, it specifically benefits your potential investors. Now, as you would see in the next slide, you would see the export performance of these countries. I mean, it's really, really growing as a proportion of the GDP. And if you look there, you would see in this surprised me. I'm sure it surprised many economists that India has also now taken over, just at the very end of the data, having a larger share of exports of goods and services as a percent of GDP. That's a statement that India is starting to raise its head more and it's starting to participate in global economic activity more. And it's something that we should capitalize on where possible. Next slide. And as you can see there, our merchandise, CARICOM merchandise exports to China, although very small in relation to what we send to the world, when we compare 2019 and 2000, it is on the rise. It is on the rise. It's still very small, but it is on the rise. And whereas to the USA, you are seeing some decline, and the CARICOM, you are seeing some decline. We need to look at the opportunities. We need to look at the potential of intra-CARICOM trade, because whilst at individual nations, we have very small population, when we include Haiti, there are some opportunities that we could capitalize on in the region, and US dollars is US dollars. And I say that because all CARICOM countries now, in my understanding of the facts, will do well to increase their foreign exchange earnings, given the various import cover ratios I see in these islands and in these various CARICOM countries. Next slide. But here you could see in terms of growth, China has become a market that we have been increasingly targeting. The percentage growth is very large, although the share is still very small. Next slide. Now, this is just, I would just quickly comment on this. This is an overlap between me and the other speaker in a small way. What I'm going to say is that the Fed has increased interest rates. And once the Fed increased interest rates, there are a number of ripples that take place. As the next slide would show, once interest rates in the USA increase, there's an increase in the unemployment rate there historically. So that could potentially, I don't think it is going to throw the US economy into a recession, but it could help to slow economic activity there. And as the next slide will show you, certainly that the growth of jobs in the USA, whilst not equal to the pre-pandemic level in terms of how low it is, it definitely is on the decline. And the slide after that would show you that as US lending rates increase, there tends to be a decline in oil prices. And I mentioned that because many CARICOM countries are importers of foreign exchange, are importers of crude oil, and by extension, when this price, when it falls, it benefits some CARICOM countries, although Suriname, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago are next exporting economies. Next slide. Now, I heard the opening speaker mention the situation in terms of tourist arrivals. And as you can see here, as we have pent up demand for tourism and whatnot, as you can see here, the CARICOM hasn't been doing that badly. And so on the medium term, I can say that we expect a continued increase in tourism arrival traffic to the region. So FCIB will want to take note of that. It is clear from the data that the comparative advantage lies in part in our tourism sector, as reflected in our tourist arrivals. And so that's something we will want to intensely go after. But because of the developmental spillover benefits for the islands, I think the way that FCIB lends, if it could include by chance conversations that include some of the value added from their investment remaining within the CARICOM sphere, and not only in creating import-oriented tourism facilities, that would be very useful for the development of the CARICOM region, given where we are at now. Next slide. This just shows that the CARICOM, and this is linked to the slide before, we continue to be have current account problems, and so when FCIB and other entities are making these investments, we would be very thankful if they keep in mind opportunities that generate foreign exchange. I urge you all to keep in mind opportunities that generate foreign exchange, even though you don't announce that. If it is we set up funding arrangements, if it is we help firms, if we keep in mind some proportion of our investment outlay to generate foreign exchange for the region. Next slide. As you can see, our manufacturing performance is very bad compared to other regions of the world. So that's an area, if you all could boost up, that would help create a lot of backward and forward linkages, help with technology, help with goods spillovers, and we would appreciate that. Next slide. So I'm trying my best to come to the time. And here we see that our external competitiveness is not the best. So when FCIB and other groups invest, we implore you all to invest in areas that doesn't worsen our external competitiveness, as is shown by the real effective exchange rate. And at the same time, it must, if you all can, help us earn foreign exchange in the region. Next slide. Our foreign direct investment inflows is not stellar, it's not the best that it could possibly be, but we have the capacity to generate foreign exchange, and we have been doing that in some way. And some of the investment we make, if it could be linked to the diaspora or foreign entities via way of partnering, that would benefit the region even more, because the current account balance that is so bad in the region is sort of counterbalanced by aid inflows and FDI inflows. Next slide. And I would close with this slide here, which simply says that our Human Development Index overall is amongst one of the highest in the world. And therefore, when we make these investments, we want to preserve that. We don't want to be mashing up our beaches. We don't want to be destroying all our forests. We want to do things in a manner and form that keeps alive the human development vibrancy of the CARICOM sphere, that is in itself is a sort of factor of production that could be used to help attract resources from various entities. So I will stop here and I will field questions later on. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to talk.
Thanks very much, Professor Hossain, for sharing your perspective. Very interesting facts, And what really stood out for me was that slide you showed on the percentage change in real income for Caribbean economies, more so the change in Guyana. And we could single that out. It was exceptionally high, which is clearly, reiterate the fact that the economy is booming. But Professor Hossain, what opportunities are there from which other CARICOM members can benefit?
And specifically in relation to Guyana, you were asking, right?
Yes.
So, Sabrina, in Guyana, almost anything you go into now is booming, because there's a high and rising per capita GDP. So that if you go and sell chicken roti, that will be booming. If you go and sell gyros, that will be booming. If you go and build hotels, it's so difficult to get hotel space in Guyana when we have CARICOM meetings and other meetings. So that's a broad answer. What I would say to you, and again, this is the way my mind thinks, and I'm throwing it out to the bank. I would say to you all, the best way to approach this situation about what are the best opportunities in Guyana is to look at the Guyanese economy and determine which aspect of the economy there are gaps. What do they import? What are the things that CARICOM economies currently export to Guyana? And given the growth trajectory of Guyana, what will they be buying more of that CARICOM countries can supply? And that way we strengthen the ecosystem within the CARICOM sphere, so that other CARICOM countries currently with productive capacity gets the opportunity to sell more of things that Guyana would be buying more of. And that would take a delve into the disaggregated GDP data, delve into the aggregated export and import data. It can be, but there is some homework to be done there that would allow you to give to your clients a more exact blocker information that increases the probability of success of any loans that you all, and increases the probability of regional foreign exchange generation from the Guyanese economy to the other non-booming CARICOM economies.
Thanks very much, Professor. And just another question. You also commented on the GDP growth in China, India, and the US, right? And you spoke about, how you showed that the CARICOM exports to China has been increasing. But tell me, what do you see as the increasing role of China inside the Caribbean, and what implications do you see from this?
Well, there are many possible opportunities available from China and to a lesser extent India in the region, given the performance of the US economy. First, to begin, Caribbean economies, we need to see about our people. And this is not about taking sides with China, India, or the USA. We need foreign exchange, we need investment opportunity, and we need market for our product. And if it is the Chinese are willing to come here and provide growth opportunities in terms of supporting various sectors, we should take that. If it is the Indians are willing to do that, we should take that. If it is the Americans are willing to counter the presence of any foreign country in the region by offering more foreign aid, by offering more access to their markets, or by encouraging their firms to plug and more foreign direct investment into our regions, we should be willing to sit down and negotiate and take those opportunities. What I would say is China is a reality. The China, as I showed you all, is, and it is projected to grow 5% in 2023 and continue to grow uh, somewhere between 4 and 5% between now and 28, according to. So CARICOM countries should watch that and they should look at this market because the amount of goods that they purchase influences commodity prices. They are doing a lot of investments in the Caribbean region, in all the countries, in Guyana, Suriname, Jamaica, the Bahamas. They are all over the place. And we need to interact with them in a way that benefits the CARICOM sphere. We need to interact and ensure that when they bring loans in, we get some of the opportunities that emanate from the investment or the aid that give to the region. There are tons of opportunities available with China. We just need to be more determined as a regional people and ensure that we in union that disadvantage the CARICOM region in any way. And that boils down to negotiation. You negotiate and you try to outcome for your people in terms of the conversation.
Okay. Thanks very much. And just to sum up, Professor Hussain, what do you consider to be the biggest risk to the region's economic outlook right now?
Well, the inflation rate in global economies are spilled over many CARICOM countries. And if you look at the external comparison of CARICOM countries, it's already affected. And because a lot of inflation filters into the Caribbean countries from the price level we import goods and services at, that is something to be concerned about. Another area to be concerned about linked to that is the slowdown in external growth, which means that our remittances, which is an important part of our development, can be affected too, which is such an important part of our development, can be affected. But within that global economic outlook, and in terms of the slow global economic activity, one looks behind the data, you would see that emerging economies like India and China continue to be very buoyant, and therefore the CARICOM economies would want to do their homework and see whether or not the time is now to have direct flights from China to the CARICOM, from India to the. How can our embassies there do more to get more investors from those countries to come in the region? Those are the economies of beauty, and they are growing rapidly. I think they are now second and third in terms of overall size. So within the global economic slowdown, I think there are still potential opportunities, but it requires our policymakers to log on to them, and it requires the banking sector, such as FCIB, to appropriately partner where possible and complement what those countries are doing here for a multiplier effect that benefits both the bank and the country, the host countries.
Okay, thanks again, Professor, for your presentation and for your responses. I'm sure that the audience has many more questions for you. Ladies and gentlemen, a reminder that you can type your questions in the Q&A window on your screen and we will address as many as we can at the end of our presentations. As we continue with our agenda, I now invite Dr. Justin Ram.
Okay, pleasant good morning, and thank you, Sabrina, and of course, always great to see Professor Hossain. From the polling, I can see that we have quite a lot of participants from all across the region. So welcome everyone. So my presentation is really meant to complement what Professor Hossain would have said, particularly at the macroeconomic level. But I'm going to sort of dive into what I consider to be some of the more microeconomic issues that I think we need to be aware of. Certainly looking at some of the dangers, but out of those dangers, I think we can also craft opportunities for our beautiful region as well. So if I just go to the next slide. In this slide, I'm showing the population dynamics across the world by continents and the percentages that are represented by each continent in the current year, 2023. As you can see here, currently Asia has the lion's share of population, and that, of course, was reflected in Professor Hossain's presentation when he spoke about the population of India and, of course, of China, with India now having the largest population. But if I look forward to 2100, which is the next slide, you can see that there is a real shift in population dynamics occurring. So from what we would have had with Asia still having, I would say, the largest share of the population. But as you can see, just across the Atlantic, from the Caribbean region and Africa, the population is likely to grow to about 40% of the global total then. I think that this also represents a significant opportunity for us in the region, fairly close trading partners, and what is even more dynamic in that African population is that that population is likely to be very young, and I would say growing in affluence. So we really do need to build trading partnerships there. And I must commend the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, who has been doing a great job in building the relations between the Caribbean and Africa, in particular Kenya, and of course some of the other countries in the western part of Africa. I would also say that Caribbean banks such as CIBC need to consider how we finance our exports to these new regions and to help us grow our markets. Next slide, please. Now, in the slide, I've tried to put together a bit of information on quite a lot on labor force participation rates and looking at global unemployment as well. What I really want the audience to focus on is the high levels of youth unemployment, which are currently in excess of 1 in 5 of our young people. This, for me, is a particularly worrying trend and one that we need to pay particular attention to. For in some of our Caribbean countries, particularly in the OECS countries, this unemployment of our young can exceed as much as 40%. And as we know that the longer you stay out of the labor market, you are not participating, it becomes almost impossible for you to return, or it becomes very difficult. And I think as policymakers and certainly as employers who might be on this call, we need to pay particular attention to this, because this means that in the future, we could be losing a lot of economic potential. But even more than that is that if people are unable to find legal employment, then there could be significant ramifications or repercussions as it relates to antisocial behavior and what impact that could possibly have on investment. So next slide, please. Now, in relation to that, it becomes, when you look at this data here, it is no surprise to me that is also linked, that high level of youth unemployment is also linked to our poor outcomes with respect to education. When we look at the CSEC exams, in fact, it is only around 22% of our children leaving secondary school are leaving with 5 or more subjects. A significant amount are leaving with 0 to 2 subjects. That is that 66% number there that you are seeing. We have to pay particular attention to this, and I think that this cannot only fall on the shoulders of our governments. This has to also lead to some sort of public-private partnership to allow us to bridge this gap. Ultimately, it is in our self-interest to ensure that our children all receive high-quality education. But more importantly, that is going to require an all-in-hands approach to this. And I think that part of this, we have to think about how we fund education. And that's why I've put some numbers up there on government expenditure on education as a percentage of GDP. I think for us in the Caribbean, we are not spending enough on education, and perhaps how we are spending those resources, we need to look at. And so financing for education is going to have to be a big topic for us if we want to improve our economic outlook and to take advantage of some of the trade opportunities that I showed earlier on. Next slide, please. Now, as I say that, I think that there is a significant opportunity lies out of what we might consider major challenges for us. Sometimes people say that you must not waste a particular challenge, as it were, and to turn that into an opportunity. We know with the geopolitical tensions that are occurring now that the United States, our most prominent trading partner, is now currently looking for nearshoring or friendshoring opportunities. And what can we do as a region to take advantage of that? What is required of us in terms of regulatory improvement, our export promotion, how we target our government apparatus to increase investment in these areas for nearshoring opportunities will actually rebound to our benefit. So I think that we have to look at these opportunities that are coming out of the current geopolitical challenges and to capture those opportunities and to take full advantage of them. Currently, we know that in our region, our competitiveness scores are not great, and we need to look at how we improve the overall business environment. I think that has to also be a job, not only for the public sector, but working in partnership with the private sector. I think funding is also going to be required to help us make the necessary shifts to improve the efficiency of our ports, for example, to improve the digital transformation of our government so that our business environment and business facilitation is also improved. Next slide, please. And so in this slide, I've just put up here some possible nearshoring opportunities, and I can speak to these more when we have the question and answers. Next slide, please. Now, coming out of a lot of geopolitical tensions as well, we know that there is likely to be a change in the reserve currency. I think that is very important for participants on this webinar to be aware of some of the trends that are going here. Recently, the BRIC countries have been speaking about developing their own currency because of these tensions. And we have to be very, very mindful as to how this is likely to impact us in terms of how countries hold their foreign exchange reserves. Are they moving away from US dollars and moving into other currencies? And when that happens, how is that likely to impact us here in the region? And I think that we have to look at our risk management approaches to determine how best we navigate this change in the currency markets that are likely to precipitate and to become even more fervent in the coming years. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that I think that it is very obvious for me that we have to pay particular attention to is the impact of artificial intelligence. I think everyone here on this call has probably looked at ChatGPT and has typed in a question there, and you were so surprised at what it comes up with. I think that this poses a significant risk for us, particularly for our children who are leaving education with little or no certification. But besides that being a risk, I think that it also offers us a significant opportunity if we are to use this technology in the right way. So it's going to have an impact on the labor market, but I think the impact, we can turn it into a positive if we make the right policy decisions now. So for example, when I speak to young people now about the impact of artificial intelligence, I tell them, do not be afraid of it, but to consider it as something that will help you boost your productivity. So what might have taken you a day to complete, with artificial intelligence, you might be able to do 5 of those in one day. And I think that for us as small countries that do not have the economies of scale, we have to utilize artificial intelligence and technology to help us build out our economies of scale. Because ultimately, with economies of scale, you need to produce more in order to reduce your average cost of production. And I think in using artificial intelligence, while it could have an impact on our labor force, if we were to train our young people in the right tools, we could actually boost our productivity and possibly our economies of scale to help us grow our competitiveness over time. Next slide, please. Now, Roger did mention the impact of the collapse of some of the banks in the US and what that could potentially mean for us. And the reason why that collapse has occurred is really because of a mismatch between the liabilities that those banks had and the assets that they were holding, and of course the impact that inflation and inevitably the effect of trying to fight that inflation via the increase in interest rates has had on their assets. So many of these banks were holding government securities, which unfortunately, and a basic economics 101 teaches us that the value of those government securities unfortunately, it goes in the opposite direction as to where interest rates are going. So it would have made sense for them to hold on to those government securities when interest rates were low and when we were in a low inflation environment. But as inflation rose and interest rates needed to rise to counter that inflation, the value of those assets tended to fall. And that is what has mainly caused the problem here. I think that in reality, this can provide us with an opportunity to think again about the financial architecture that we need to think about. And I think that banks like CIBC have to consider how they deploy resources more into investment rather than into lending. I think that investment, particularly in the type of investment that we need in the region to build resilience to climate change, for example, requires us to invest in things now that have benefits for us way into the future. And so lending for that becomes very difficult. But if you can invest in it and so take an equity position in it, it changes the dynamic of that financial decision. And more, I think that this opportunity, and what I'm showing here, is that we need to think about how we turn excess liquidity away from how we have traditionally held it, and to consider putting that more into investment prospects that will, that will over time boost the resilience of our financial sector, but also particularly help us boost the resilience of our economies. And these are some ideas which we can discuss later on. Next slide, please. The need for digital transformation, I've spoken about that. I have here in particular the need for financial digitalization. And how do we utilize that, for example, to improve financial inclusion? And I think for me, one of the big things about digital transformation and the move towards the use of digital for financial transactions could really work for us to also help us fight our crime surge that we have been having in the region recently. I think that as a region, we need to move considerably, almost 100% of our transactions in digital format, so that to help us improve efficiency, to help us improve financial inclusion, and to help us counter this huge crime wave that we're seeing in some of our countries. I think that has to happen. And I think the way we do that, we have to come up with some type of a financial or some type of a bank account that allows people to be able to simply do transactions, not necessarily have access to credit, because of course that is the issue that we are grappling with. But I think we need to come up with some way in using the digital transformation to help us as well with KYCC requirements and AML and FT and fighting terrorism finances as well. These things we need to use digital for. And I think that all of us have to consider moving towards the use of digital IDs over time. Where I am in Turks and Caicos government, we're currently working with the government here to introduce a national digital ID, which would require biometric information. I think that eventually we need to move towards that to help us with our identification of our citizens and our residents, and to help stamp out illegal activity. Next slide, please. Now, this slide, a bit of animation here, shows us the impact of storms in the region. You know, on average, our region loses about 2% of GDP every year from natural disasters. Without a doubt, we need to build resilience to this. We can't hold our head and cry. It is a reality. We live in a very bad neighborhood whereby we have visitors who, unfortunately, we give them names like Jane and Anderson, or I'm not sure what are the names of the hurricanes for this year, but we tend to give them names, and however, they wreak really, really very terrible havoc on us. And we need to now build resilience to this, because this is the reality that we live in with the climate change. And if we believe the science, then it's likely to get worse. And the frequency and intensity of these storms leading to an ever larger decrease in our GDP when these storms hit. We need to stop that right now and invest in resilience. And again, how we invest in that is going to be critical for us. And the type of financing that we need is going to be really critical for us. And I think that CIBC and your customers have to pay particular attention to this whenever they are making investment decisions now. We need to think about putting in that extra investment to build that resilience, to improve business continuity, to ensure that when a storm happens, we're not losing our business activity. And so that brings me to the next slide, of course, whereby we need to think about how we access development finance in the region. Our governments need to find new sources of finance. But let me say this to you. There is no way that the type of finance we need to help us build resilience is going to come from the international community. Some will come, but we need to find ways to have blended finance and to utilize the excess liquidity that we have in our region, which is currently held by many of our banks, to blend our resources, our domestic resources that we have here, to blend that with the international finance that we are trying to come from. Initiatives such as the Bridgetown Initiative that Prime Minister Mia Mottley is certainly championing. But how do we now utilize concessional resources from development banks, from places like the World Bank, the Caribbean Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank? How do we utilize those resources and blend those with some of our resources to help us build resilience? That is a big topic that I think that CIBC and other financial intermediaries in our region has to pay particular attention to. And it's not only about building resilience to storms, but it's how do we build mitigation? How do we transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to one based on renewable energy, let's say? That is the type of resilience. How do we build in resilience at a social level to ensure that we also have our labor force that can participate in that new economy that is certainly fast approaching? Next slide, please. I just want to touch on this because I think that for our region, we have really been operating with a constitutional framework that has come out of our independence movements within the Westminster frame. As I can see it now, we need to have a new social contract, and we need to have new constitutions that reflect our current realities. I think that this has to be ongoing work. And this is not something that governments can do alone. This has to be something that the private sector and the non-government sector has to play a role in. And so I just put this up here as an area that we have to pay particular attention to, because more and more our social contracts and our constitutions are showing that they are no longer fit for purpose and are not able to take us in the direction that is required to help us be nimble and to help us make the required transition for us to be successful in that new world order that is certainly coming, and to help us navigate the trade opportunities that we have and the financial opportunities that are there. Next slide, please. Now, one of the issues that I think we have to be mindful of is that unfortunately we have very low implementation rates. So as I have here, public investment implementation rates, you know, for many of our projects are going too slow. Sometimes we're only implementing 33% of what we said that we would do. And as you can see here, I've put some information that I've managed to glean on some of our Caribbean countries, and I've bunched the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union together. Guyana, I would say, would need significant assistance with its implementation, particularly what's happening now with the amount of resources that are going there. Implementation is a difficult thing. And I think more and more effort has to be placed in it. It's not just about financing. We can get the finance, but if we can't put the finance to work to help us develop and to help us grow our economies, then we are going to be in real problems. And so those low implementation rates that I show here are something for us to pay attention to, and I think we need to have investment in this. And in addition to this, the level of capital expenditure as a percentage of GDP is far too low for us if we want to grow our economies. As we know, an economy is rarely built on the capital base of the foundations of economic growth is related to this capital base. That is human capital, but also infrastructure and human-made capital as well as financial capital, of course, and social capital. But those first two are quite critical, and I think we're not spending enough on capital expenditures. Next slide, please. And so one of the things, you know, I just have to also say that we, you know, as a firm, we are focused on implementation, and these are just some of the steps that we're doing. As I said, I am currently lead advisor to the Premier of Turks and Caicos government and trying to help this country implement its priorities. And this is how we go about doing it. And one of the things I really want to say is that communication is important. How do you bring your stakeholders along with you? None of this that we're doing in Turks and Caicos can happen with the government alone. It happens in partnership with the private sector, and communicating with all stakeholders and making sure that they have bought and taking on board their reactions and their comments at all times is very important for us. Prioritization has to be a key aspect of this, and so that visioning is critical. But just thought that I would put this here because I think that that's an area that we need to pay particular attention to as we try to transition to that new resilient economy that we must build. So next slide. I think that probably brings me to the end of my presentation, and I want to thank you, Sabrina, and to your audience for allowing me an opportunity to make this presentation to you. Thank you.
You're very much welcome, Dr. Ram, and you certainly gave us some food for thought. You know, you spoke about artificial intelligence, and you're certainly right. AI is really a hot topic for this year. You see where Microsoft shares are going, you know, and we have seen the growth of ChatGPT. I mean, I have a teenager, right? So I see it. Tell me, how do you see this trend impacting the labor force in our region in the medium and long term?
Well, I see significant challenges. Yeah. Now, I probably also see these as significant opportunities. So in areas where there are not those many skills required, we have to be mindful of. And for us in a region where we're seeing so many of our students leaving school without proper certification, that means that many of our participants in our labor force could be extremely adversely impacted from this. But even more importantly than that, Sabrina, I think even for some of our skilled professions, like the legal profession, whereby you can now draft legal documents using AI, we are going to see a significant change. Personally, I think that's a good thing because we do need to shake up some of our traditional sectors. But I think that what has to happen now is that we can't wait. You know, too often in the region, we are waiting for things to take us. We need to, as we say, take in front before in front takes us. And we need to start thinking about how we make that shift in our education curricula. And I think that that also means how it has to be about training persons for continuous education. And so one of the things I really want to say here is that we need to stop streaming at 11 plus, and we need to stop streaming at 14 plus. Those types of outdated education systems are no longer required for our region. That has to stop. And it is very important for us to inculcate even in adults that you need to learn. So, you know, even when you're in your 40s and 50s, you should be learning. So it has to be one education that is focused more on continuous curiosity rather than on qualifications. That has to be the shift that happens. And so for me, I think that we have to considerably think about a reorientation of our education system and to ensure that everyone gets access to good quality education, not only a few, and to stop the streaming that occurs at 11 plus and at 14 plus. That is very, very outdated. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I know. We all as parents feel the ills of those exams. Dr. Ram, today, CIBC First Caribbean has arranged approximately US 500 million in blue and green financing in the region. And we really are, we continue with this initiative. How can regional countries increase resilience and sustainability in areas beyond climate matters, such as supply pipelines, food security, as well as public health?
Well, first of all, let me say well done to CIBC for doing that. I mean, you're sure that you're a leader regionally in that regard. So I want to thank you for doing that. And that's what we need. We need that leadership from the private sector like yourselves to be doing that. And that's a type of initiative that I think is going to be critical. So while you have done that for blue and green financing, I think that there are really other opportunities that can help us grow our economy by helping us build resilience in our supply chains. So, for example, at the CARICOM level, we have spoken about the need to improve our food security and to have, as a region where we are consuming maybe 25% within the region from what we have grown. But what is going to be required for that? It's not just words. How do we go about implementing that and financing that? But there requires a lot of logistics associated with it. I don't think necessarily that we want the governments to be leaning on this. They have given us a vision as to where we need to go. Now we need the private sector to step in. I think on regional transport, that has to be an area where we see much more significant investment. Anybody who tries to travel around the region knows how difficult it is, and particularly with the demise of Liat. We have had some private sector firms coming in to fill the gap, but they need investment, and they need investment now. And not only in terms of air transport, I think in terms of marine transport, this has to be an area that we look into to try to develop. And I think that there are significant opportunities if we work with the regulators, but if we're able to get the right financing to the entrepreneurs and the business community who are willing to take the risk there. But of course, the risk metric always improves if the financing that comes with it is much better and in better terms. And here I would say, while lending is required, of course, we need to see more investment and equity investment in these types of things so that everybody is in it together as it were. That for me is a critical component. More equity and investment in what is required to help us improve our competitiveness.
Okay, thank you. And just one last question before we turn over to the audience. You spoke about, geopolitical tensions increasing and, nearshoring opportunities for us here in the Caribbean. Are there primary sectors outside of tourism and the hydrocarbon markets you think regional governments and the private sector should focus on to fuel economic growth in our part of the globe?
Yeah, I spoke about this because I had done a study for the Organization of American States back in 2021, but that started off in the first year of the pandemic. And what we looked at really was the our capacity and our constraints that we have as small islands, but also looking at the market opportunities for what we are currently doing at a very small scale. And what this analysis threw up for me was quite remarkable. And while we only looked at 3 countries in the Caribbean, which was Barbados, St. Lucia, and Guyana, what I found was that there were significant opportunities in, for example, electrical manufacturing, medical devices, things like that, that I really didn't think that those were areas that we should be focusing on. But the data was saying to us that we did have a possible capacity that those areas needed to be nurtured for us to start thinking about nearshoring opportunities. But I think some of the more obvious areas are related to our education. So Professor Hossain is at our University of the West Indies, which is well renowned. I think that needs to become much more of a foreign exchange earner for us. And not only that, partnering perhaps with other foreign universities to ensure that perhaps we have more students coming into here. So for example, St. George's University in Grenada generates about over 25% of GDP in that country. And so I think that medical tourism that is related to also medical tertiary level education is a significant area for us. And you know, the pandemic showed us that we live in a beautiful region and people want to come and live here beyond just studying. Why not capitalize on that? And one of the things I want to say here is that we have millions of tourists visiting us using cruise ships. And while there's not much value added from that, we should be using cruise ships as a postcard for them to say, hey, look at this, you have seen an island and you see how beautiful it is. Why not come back and stay longer? Or why not think about coming here and investing or sending your children to school here? I think that we have to take more advantage of some of the things that we're doing now to help us earn more and more foreign exchange. And I have to agree with Professor Hossain where he said, we really need investment in how we earn more foreign exchange or reduce our foreign exchange usage through the consumption of imports.
Thanks very much. We are now at the end of our panel discussion. Thank you very much, Professor Hossain and Dr. Ram, for such insightful presentations. Indeed, our Caribbean region cannot, we just cannot simply be onlookers as the larger developed economies evolve and move forward with technology. We certainly need to adjust and keep up. So, ladies and gentlemen, we now open the floor for questions. You can simply type your questions in the Q&A window, and I will read them as in the order of that they come in. So, the very first question we have here: how do you foresee the development of the private market and private equity activity in the region?
Hello.
Yes, I'm hearing you.
Do you want me to answer, or how do you want it to go?
Yes, yeah, you can answer that one, Dr. Ram.
Yeah. What I think needs to happen here, first of all, is that we have to ensure we have the right regulatory environment. So in some of our countries, for example, we have had the establishment of stock exchanges, including the junior stock exchanges. And we have also had regulation that allowed us to develop mutual funds, including unit trust corporations as well. That is good. However, I think we need to boost our regulation and laws as it relates to things like venture capital and angel finance. It's not quite clear. I think as well that Jamaica has shown us that you can develop your stock market in such a way that it can actually boost this type of activity, because ultimately the stock exchange is the exit mechanism for investment in any new venture. And so development of the junior stock exchange across the region, I think, has to be improved. And so we need to find a way to ensure that we link all of our stock exchanges and our capital markets together, because we need greater liquidity. I think that has to be an area that we look at. Doesn't make sense Barbados having its own, Trinidad, Jamaica, the Eastern Caribbean, for example. We need to link it so that we have capital moving around, but we need to have the right regulatory environment to accompany that. And then again, I think that we then need to encourage to have the type of investments like mutual funds, which I think companies like CIBC can pioneer and to develop, so that we can pool our resources and to have the professionals at places like CIBC manage those resources and to have them channeled into the right areas depending on the resource requirements that are required. So I think we need to have regulation, linked markets. We need to have the proper professionals, such as persons like yourselves at CIBC, managing that. And of course, then encourage the mom and pop investors to put their money in there and then to utilize those resources for the needed investments across our region and the various ventures.
Thanks very much, Dr. Ram. Professor Hussain, I'll direct this one to you. How do you see the changes in the global economy affecting the real estate industry in Caribbean over the next few years? Professor Hussain, you're on mute.
Sorry about that, and thanks for the question. So there are layers to the response in that the slowdown in global economic activity would in some little way and in some form reduce the demand for real estate in the Caribbean by foreign investors. So in some CARICOM countries, you would see that people from Germany, people from the UK, people from the USA, they buy up spots in the coastal areas, they buy up spots in very scenic areas, and that type of family level demand, that type of demand by diaspora would perhaps fall as global economic activity on the whole falls. What I mentioned before, though, is that within the global economic activity, there are some countries that would be doing better than others. And if it is, we are into the real estate business where we are trying to sell real estate within the CARICOM sphere to foreigners, then it would make sense to sell to those countries where the economy is vibrant and the economy is buoyant. And certainly, the Chinese has a big appetite for foreign presence. The Chinese are in every country and they are looking for investment in various form and fashion. And that would be one place we could look to for a sale of real estate in the CARICOM sphere. But as economic activity within the CARICOM itself slows, based on the numbers that we are seeing, and as ripples from the foreign economy enter into the CARICOM sphere, and I keep saying ripples because I actually tested using something called a structural VAR model, the impact of changes in GDP in the USA and various countries on the CARICOM sphere. And if the US economy slows down, our economy definitely feels the ripple. What I would suggest, therefore, is that the growth that is taking place within the CARICOM region, although not as buoyant as it used to be, would continue to create some demand for real estate by certain segments of the population within the region. What we may now need to do, though, is we may now need to develop our real estate market differently. We may need to sell property, to develop real estate and put it on the market that are more town and country approved, that are at certain advanced stages, so when the buyer comes in, it is almost ready to use. Sometimes you purchase property within the region, and when you follow up on some of the activities with town and country or other type of institutions that you need to go to, you realize there are inhibitions, you realize there are obstacles. So in the context of the change in market, the real estate market itself would have to advertise more. They will have to improve the presentation of their product, their market readiness of their product, and try to therefore, through those modifications, maintain the volume of sales and the value of sales that they had before. What I would say, Sabrina, in relation to that, is the citizenship by investment program in some of the OECD countries has been a vehicle through which real estate sales in some of those countries have been kept buoyant in one form or the other, and it has also brought in development finance. And it would be good if the real estate sector throughout the region could think more along those lines in the context with, of course, their line ministries of relevance. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Hussain. Um, uh, Dr. Ram, I'll give this one to you because I know you spoke about BRICS having their own current moving away from reserve US being the reserve currency. So, given some nations are moving away from trading in US dollars, what are the major risks, in your opinion, for the ecosystem that currently supports the US dollar?
Well, let me first say that the US's dollar is likely to remain very significant for some time. So this risk, there are some risks, but not significant for us. I mean, it's still going to be our major trading currency. However, if we are now considering trying to access new markets, which might be in Africa, who knows, even South Africa, as they are part of the BRICS trading network. India, China, as Roger has identified those as critical markets. They might require payments in a different currency simply to avoid some of the geopolitical risks that are occurring now. I think that we simply have to pay attention to this. I think it's more for our regulators, our central banks, who usually have to manage our foreign exchange reserves. They would have to pay particular attention to that. I was seeing an article where some 30 countries have already agreed to use the new BRICS currency. So I think it's something that's coming and we have to be mindful of. But I think at the moment, in the short to medium term, the US dollar is still likely to remain the hegemon, as it were, within the trading network. Price of oil is still widely still in US dollars, and that's always a good metric. The moment that changes, then we certainly have to also think about changing as well. But of course, over time in the coming decades, oil is likely to reduce in significance with respect to the need for it for economic activity. So, you know, there are a lot of changes. Geopolitically, we're small, we're in the Western Hemisphere. We have to manage that risk. USA is still our largest trading partner. That is not going to change for any time soon. And so I think as countries, maintaining good relationship with the United States is critical for us and critical for our social and economic well-being.
Okay, thanks very much, Dr. Ram. So guys, we're a little against the time. So what I'll do just to sort of wrap things up, I'm just going to ask one last question, and I'll give you both yourself and Professor Hussain an opportunity to answer this one. And one of our audience members says, overcoming the volatility on commodity terms of trade and lack of economy of scale competitiveness requires increased investment in training labor to become not just more productive, but yet also more innovative. What do you think would be the best way to measure and improve the Caribbean's level of innovative output and investment in its production?
So,
Professor Hussain, you go first.
Yeah, I will respond to that. It's a good question. It's very, very challenging. I think if we immediately knew the answer to that, me and Justin would probably be on a beach somewhere in the Bahamas relaxing. Such is the demand for the answers for those type of questions. The point being that I wouldn't immediately go though to what are the specific factors that could lead to innovation. What I would say is if we deepen CARICOM and ensure that we have a population 14 million, and even wider if we include some of the associate states, in which trade are not met by intra-regional obstacles, then that dynamic of its own would get the private sector going in a sufficiently large intra-CARICOM market that could help to create opportunities. US dollars are US dollars regardless of if it comes from an internal CARICOM country or from the US or from Canada. So from where I sit, I think we need to boost intra-CARICOM trade, remove some of the obstacles that exist, deepen CARICOM ties, encourage some of the associate member states and some of the peripheral countries like Cuba and Dominican Republic and Curacao and Aruba and whatnot to take more meaningful part in CARICOM at the level of quoted. And in so doing, that would crowd in behavioral responses from the private sector to capitalize on the trade opportunities and the foreign exchange earning opportunities that transformation allows, and the innovation would follow. In other words, we have to create the enabling environment. That doesn't mean that we don't need to lower the murder level in the region in some countries. That's obviously an obstacle. So we fix the ease of doing business on the one hand, and the other hand, on the regional level, we create room for this production integration and for this larger market so that countries can sell their output easier. This brings us back to the transportation comment that Justin mentioned. Can sell their output within the region in a more voluminous way without intra-regional obstacles that are unnecessary, so that the private sector firm has the incentive via profits to innovate and improve to make even more profits. That's the way I would phrase my response.
Thanks very much, Professor. Dr. Ram?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I got the question right, but I'll just build a little bit on what Professor Hossain has said. You know, to get innovation requires us to have a different mindset, not only in terms of at the individual level, but I think at a societal level. So for example, innovation really leads to persons taking positions and to take risks to then try to have some economic benefit out of that. We need to have a framework that allows more risk taking, and to say to persons that if you try and you fail, that's not the end of you. So we need to take I would take a page out of the US's bankruptcy laws, for example, and ensure that we have those sort of protections here as well. Because we want people to take risks. We want people to be innovative. We want private sector to be innovative. And so that also brings me to the area of education. The greatest source of innovation tends to come at the tertiary level. We need to find a way to ensure that persons like Professor Hossain and some of his other colleagues at the University of the West Indies can bring many of their ideas and products to market. And so we need to have monies going into there for research and development. So I think we need to boost our expenditure on research and development. But more importantly, I think that we need to have that partnership between the university and the private sector to ensure that those new ideas, those new products come to market and ultimately turn these innovations into economic outcomes of growth and prosperity and jobs. Because ultimately, I think for us as a region, we have to stop focusing on outputs and start focusing on the outcomes that we want. And for me as an economist, I've always focused on the conditions under which people live. Are we doing things to improve that? And if we're not, then as economists, we're not really doing a good job. And so the outcomes are really important. And I think if we want innovation, we need to have innovation that is boosting economic activity, growth, ultimately jobs, and of course the well-being of our people. And so we have to, it's an entire partnership of the right regulations to encourage innovation, to encourage risk-taking, to get the financing into there, to allow investors to exit that investment via our junior and secondary stock exchanges, for example. It's a whole ecosystem that has to grow with it. And I agree with Roger. It's going to be much more easier if we do that in a market of 10, 20 million people rather than a market of 60,000 or 1.4 million or 2.4 million people. The more people we have, then it's going to be easier for our products to then thrive. And then from here, as Japan used to do in years gone by, utilize your domestic market to test and honing your skills there. And then once you've achieved that, you can then export to the wider world a product or service that has been well tested and grounded in your local market. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Ram. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we have reached the end of our Q&A session, and I want to thank you so much for your active participation. And I know we do have additional questions. So for those of you who have those questions and you would like them to be addressed, please send me an email and I will get them to either Professor Hossain or Dr. Ram. You will see my contact information on the screen at the close of the webinar. To deliver our closing remarks, I now invite Adam Carter, our Executive Director in Investment Banking at CIBC First Caribbean. Adam is the Managing Director and Head of Investment Banking, Foreign Exchange and Derivatives, covering some of the bank's largest clients and transactions. He has spent his career in the capital markets and corporate finance space, both in the Caribbean and in Canada. While at First Caribbean, he and his team have executed over US 10 billion of transactions for the bank's strategic clients, and he has led the bank to be the recipient of various recognized awards. So I now welcome Adam.
Thanks, Sabrina. Thanks very much. Great job hosting. Special thanks to Dr. Hossain and Dr. Ram for what I would consider a very insightful and interesting conversation. Special thanks to all the participants, our clients across the region who joined us and asked questions. Sorry we ran out of time. I know there's a few lingering questions, but we'll do our best to facilitate those. For me, I'll be brief here because I know we're over time. Clearly, there are takeaways, clearly there are headwinds in the global market. Dr. Hossain mentioned GDP slowdown. We've got geopolitical tensions, shipping and logistical challenges, global currency threats, as mentioned by Dr. Ram, and of course, uncertain financial markets, particularly in the US and global markets, and of course, inflationary pressures. Notwithstanding all of these pressures are foreign in nature, they often feel very close to home for our people, for our SMEs, for our corporates, our governments. And so the discussion here is very topical. We here at First Caribbean understand that we play a lead role in helping facilitate solving a lot of these challenges. And so, we welcome this discussion and we look forward to continuing these discussions with our important clients, prospective clients, our current clients, whether that be governments, SMEs, individuals, and of course communities, about how we can play a role in offering solutions that allow clients to meet their ambitions and to solve some of these key problems. With that in mind, we'll leave our contact details, as Sabrina mentioned, at the end. We're happy to facilitate any answers of questions, happy to carry on the conversation, happy to engage in discussions around solutions and opportunities, and really wanted to thank everyone for joining. Again, special thanks to our expert panelists, to Sabrina and Tiffany, who did a great job opening and moderating. And I wish everyone a pleasant day and remainder of the week. And thanks one last time. Take care.
Bye.